So good morning, everyone. Thank you to all of the attendees who have called in to join this live panel session on financial planning and budgeting for humanitarian projects. This is the next session in the IEEE SIGHT Education Subcommittee webinars. And I believe that this session is going to be extremely useful for SIGHT members, especially those who are in SIGHT groups and who are implementing or planning to implement sustainable development projects. I'm very excited to introduce the three panelists that we have today for this session. We have the IEEE SIGHT Project Subcommittee Chair, Dr. Karen Panetta. Dr. Karen is a fellow of IEEE, and she has held many positions within IEEE, including the 2011 chair of the Boston section. She's been chair of IEEE Women in Engineering and chair of the Boston Education Society chapter, in addition to the Boston Signal Processing Society chapter. And then this year, in addition to be the project subcommittee chair with SIGHT, she is also president of the HKN Board of Governors. We are very, very happy to have her here in this session today and believe that her insight is going to be extremely useful for this session. And so one of our other panelists today is Khanjan Mehta, who is the inaugural Vice Provost for Creative Inquiry and Director of the Mountaintop Initiative at Lehigh University. He has served as the Associate Editor for the IEEE Technology and Society magazine. He's also a contributing editor for the Engineering for Change portal and is a published author. His book, Solving Problems That Matter and Getting Paid for It, takes a deep dive into STEM careers and social innovation and global sustainable development. Khanjan, we're really happy to have you here on this session today and are looking forward to your insight coming from your perspective of Metrics Framework Subcommittee Chair. And finally, we have Dr. Pritpal Singh, or Polly, as many of you may know him as. He is a professor of electrical engineering at Villanova University, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses in the area of semiconductor microelectronics, power electronics, renewable energy systems, sustainable product development for low resource settings, and information and communication technologies for development. So we're really thrilled to have Dr. Polly join us today as a panelist because of his extensive experience working in developing countries such as Ecuador, such as Nicaragua, and all of this feet on the ground project experience that he has had, also his familiarity with working with students and others who might just be learning about how to conduct sustainable development projects. So we're very happy to have a well-rounded panel for our session today. Due to time, we're going to get right started in with the questions. We'll have about 40 minutes for the panelists to share their thoughts on some questions that we've drafted. And then for about 15 minutes at the end of the session, we'll have a time for question and answers with the participants in the audience. So we can just jump in with our first questions, and I will direct this one to you, Polly. Could you talk a little bit about, just starting at the very beginning, basic level, why it's necessary to have a budget for a humanitarian project, and what risks can be avoided or mitigated with having a well-prepared and planned budget for a project?
Okay, yeah, I can take that question, Juliana. Thank you. So it's important in any project as you're planning to come up with a plan for what you're going to do, the activities that you're going to be doing, and put together a timeline for those project activities. And then with that, then you need to estimate what would be the costs of the different activities. So let's say you're traveling to a site, in a budget for the cost of traveling to the site, maybe for food during the time that you're there. Perhaps you may need to stay overnight. So all of these things have costs associated with them. And so you need to plan. And then if, for example, you're installing, let's say, a solar electric system at the site, you need to consider what would be the costs of the different components of the system, and then take into account any shipping costs, any taxes, things like that that also need to be incorporated into a budget. So it's important to, as part of the planning process, to develop a carefully prepared budget, because that is what you're going to need to be able to execute the project.
That's great. Thank you so much, Polly. And Karen, I'll direct this next question to you. What are some common challenges to creating a budget for a humanitarian project?
Sure. Okay. So some of the challenges come from not understanding some of the local, what I would say the local needs are, if you don't really scope those out well. So for instance, sometimes to get permits or to do studies or things like that that you might need to get community buy-in, I would say, are really important. So the first thing that we look at when somebody comes into a project is we say, do they have a true collaboration with the community? And that comes in many flavors. So you want to make sure that you've met with the appropriate people, and sometimes they'll tell you that there are affiliated costs with that. So if you're working in some sort of park that has admissions or admission prices, or if you need to use their staff or their guards, their security services, if they're unionized, so you can't just go say, well, I'm going to go pay, hire my own people to do that. So that's one of the challenges, is understanding what some of the local requirements. The other thing is understanding the differences between, you're supposed to be budgeting things to get materials for the project, to be able to implement the project. It's not to budget salaries for the people, the volunteers doing the project. So that's a big one. Sometimes people think that, they can make this their job, and no, that's a big challenge for us, because it's like you're supposed to be doing much more volunteering and only paying for the services that you need that otherwise you can't get through volunteers. So those are some of the challenges, as well as estimating travel and building in contingencies. So for instance, if the rainy season comes around and all of a sudden your project gets delayed and you're on the ground and you budgeted for like a week's hotel stay, and all of a sudden the rainy season comes in and you need to stay for 2 weeks. So those are some of the things you need to think about when you're budgeting in, and plan those in as contingencies.
Definitely something that people will want to take into account before submitting a budget to be considered for funding. Khanjan, I believe I'll direct this next question to you. Karen has talked a little bit about some of these unforeseen changes in the project. Do you have any advice for groups about how they could handle any kind of unforeseen challenge, whether that be timeline delays or unforeseen expenses? How can people take risk mitigation steps from a financial standpoint to deal with some of those unforeseen challenges?
Wow, I think I can answer that question from two perspectives. First is as somebody who writes a lot of funding proposals, projects and settings that are pretty chaotic, right? When you're working in a developing country context, there are just so many things that could just crop up, and that's where having broader categories is very helpful. The other strategy that I've used successfully is first of all, a core principle of engagement would be equity, right? You want equity from and equity between all the stakeholders. So you want to have the SIGHT chapter, the communities that you're working with, other stakeholders come together and say, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we get out of this? And one approach then would be to take some of the costs that would be highly variable and make that have that equity, have those costs be covered by the other stakeholders, so that the budget for the HSE or site project is somewhat more dependable, and there are fewer vulnerabilities in that budget. So that, I think, is one approach. are extremely common, and I would like to think that the IEEE site understands that really well. Things never ever go as planned, and you have to be ready to pivot. And I'd like to say that and think that if there is a reasonable amount of change that is happening, then explaining that and coming back to site would be a valid approach.
Great, thank you. And maybe this question I'll offer to the whole panel. I know we've already touched on some of these elements, but what are things that people might forget to include in their project budget, but are really essential to the budget, very, very important to include?
So one thing I would submit is understanding the actual costs of components in country, particularly if you're bringing them in from outside. So there'll be some shipping costs, there may be import duties, and so those are certainly ones that need to be accounted for.
So I'd like to take this question in a different direction and reinforce the point that all stakeholders should have some skin in the game and should have something that they're contributing towards a project. And I think whether that is written up in the formal project proposal, part of some kind of a working document, working collaboration document, the partners, it will be helpful to identify what resources, whether it's funding, whether it's sweat equity, the partnering communities are contributing towards the project. And I would kind of make that clear from the get-go. The budget for the entire project should certainly be much larger than what is being submitted to and paid for by SIGHT or HAC.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that sometimes we see items that, somebody will, maybe they throw in, say, oh, we need, five computers or something like that. And then when you look back at the description, you're saying, well, what are the computers used for? So justifying what you're going to use things for. So if you're going to, it should tie back to where in the project is this actually going to be used. And the other big questionable thing sometimes our committees struggle with is when we see travel costs for or somebody the discrepancy between someone who's running a business and who is key personnel on the budget for the site project. So it looks like, are we funding a business or are we funding a volunteer project? And that's usually comes up, and we ask a lot of questions when we see that type of thing. So it's okay to be involved in a professional business, but you need to be able to distinguish what that person's role is and what they're actually being funded for, and it versus salary, but also be cognizant that we are going to go back and look at the line items and say, what you put in your budget, does it make sense? Where does this tie back in? So try to connect in your budget justification of why you need different types of equipment or things that you might not see a direct connection to.
Great. Yeah, those are all really wonderful advice for those who are considering or maybe in the middle of conducting a project. Khanjan, I'd like this next question to go to you as the Metrics Framework Subcommittee Chair. As many of the participants may know, depending on how familiar they are with HAC and SIGHT, and the focus that one of our focus this year has been on impact assessment, which is a vital step in implementing sustainable development projects. How can groups set themselves up for success financially, at least when it comes to determining what they have accomplished?
Sure. So this is not something I can answer in 2 minutes, but I would like to point our audience to probably 3 different webinars on this topic that have happened in the past. There was one that I did on sustainable operating models for site projects a few weeks back. There was one that Dr. Ku McMahon from USA did a few months back, and there was one that Sue Baggett did as well. And I would strongly recommend folks to kind of check out those 3 webinars. And one of the common themes that you will see emerge is the development of a logic model. where you clearly identify your inputs, your activities, your outputs and outcomes, and what are those outcomes that you're actually striving for, and how will your budget drive that strategy? And how do all the different stakeholders have skin in the game in kind of reaching those set of outcomes that everybody has agreed on would be worth pursuing. And if we are able to then identify not more than 3 very specific metrics of success for those outcomes, then and keeping track of those metrics of success with a clear way would be a way to ensure that you're actually having the impact that you envisioned at the project. So that's a somewhat generic answer, but I would say go back and develop a logic model, and 2, identify not more than 3 very specific metrics of success for the project. And I would also recommend that one of those metrics fundamentally be tied to fiscal responsibility. So if you're installing solar panels at a school, then looking at the number of students and number of teachers who will benefit from having access to light in terms of their educational outcomes would be a wonderful output. A really good outcome, on the other hand, would be looking at how has that access to light led to stronger educational outcomes. That might be a little difficult to measure, but doing that over the longer term of 2 to 3 years would be a wonderful exercise. Finally, the third metric I would choose in that case would be how are we also putting aside some resources, whether that is through cost recovery, that is by providing additional services like letting people charge their phones or batteries, or whatever else, that money is available to fix the charge controller or to fix, put some new light bulbs or whatever else is needed in the longer term.
That's wonderful, and thank you for just that very brief overview of the logic model, the difference between outputs and outcomes. Those are things that are really, really important when it comes to assessing the impact that project teams are having. And this question, I think I'll open up again to all of our panelists. When thinking more broadly about the use of project budgets and creating one, are there any resources that you could recommend that groups consult or use as they are determining their project budget?
So this is Karen. I know that we see a lot of electrification projects, and we see lots of and everybody specifies kind of technologies that's tried and true. So sometimes seeing what a previous project used as a template, you might not be using the same equipment and things like that, but you can see how they budgeted it out. And if you have a very different project, but even still using that sort of template for the broad categories is kind of important. I think one of the things that somebody just brought up was talking about, making sure there's money around for, replacing components and things like that. But one of the biggest things that we look at when we're evaluating a project, and why we say community buy-in is so important, is we don't want to go build this beautiful project and then have it dismantled by vandalism or taken apart because the parts themselves are more worthwhile to people. So I think that, or have them be broken and not have the capability to repair it. So we look at what I would say is, how do you budget in for sustainability, even if you're not there anymore? How will the project continue, and what kind of community buy-in and support will they get? Resource-wise, that's another way to look at it when you look at other proposals, to see how did they build that in. And I think that's why it's important to look at previous ones as well. The other thing sometimes is to actually contact vendors. Sometimes if you're speccing out a system, they might say, oh, we have this worksheet, to help you figure out, oh, based on how much power, how much area, and they give you these great templates for you to really figure out, okay, if I'm going to electrify 5 houses, and this is how much power I need in each one, and how kind of devices. They even okay, do they have microwaves? Do they have refrigerators? It actually will almost be like a program that you just plug and play the typical type of usage, and then you get a more accurate reading, and it'll even spit out the parts list you need for that vendor. So, you know, when you go and you purchase these components or you're looking at which vendors, ask them if they have templates, worksheets to help you figure out what you need. And the product services for each of these people also, sometimes they'll do it for you, which is really cool. So consider that when you're investigating vendors, because they want to make money too.
Sure, definitely. I think we'll go ahead just in the interest of time and move on to our next question. And the following questions, including the next one, will be a little bit more specific to the HAC and SIGHT project budget context, knowing that our audience are IEEE volunteers. They're interested in most likely conducting a project, and so we can give some very specific practical tips and advice related to that. And Polly, maybe I'll ask you this next question. What is the general framework for a SIGHT project budget? Any recommendations you would have for distributing funds and breaking down the costs among categories? And then maybe if you could also touch on what budget categories are allowed and what things are not allowed. And I know Karen mentioned that in one of her earlier responses, but if we could just go over that again.
Yeah, so I think that as Karen noted earlier, that really salaries for volunteers who are executing the project, the IEEE volunteers, are not allowed for the budget for SIGHT and HAC projects. That these are expected to be projects that IEEE volunteers volunteer to spend their time to implement. But of course, direct project costs such as the equipment that you need to be able to do the project, any materials and supplies. Let's say, for example, you're doing a workshop and you need some supplies to have the workshop delivered, then those would be reasonable expenses. Any travel to the community, that's again eligible expenses. And then Karen mentioned you may have some professionals that you need to engage for particular aspects of the project, and they can be paid for their services. So for example, if you need a professional installer to do some installation work, then there's, that could be a valid expense. But to the extent that you can use volunteer labor, or as Khanjan mentioned, have the community also provide their own sweat equity, their participation, so they're also providing help with the project even without payment, but they're providing their skills and so on. That's very important. And I think, as Karen mentioned as well, just justifying and linking the project activities to the budget, making sure that there's a good connection there, and justification is important. The costs are reasonable and match with the expectations of the project. I think the other thing I should mention is that indirect costs are not allowed for these projects. Only direct costs would be allowed.
Why don't you, can you explain to so those that aren't academics what indirect costs are versus direct costs?
Yeah, so for example, when you're working in an office, you have expenses related to lighting, telephone services, internet connections, and so on. So those are all considered part of the overhead of running your operation. And those costs are not allowed to be charged to the budget for a SIGHT or HAC project. So I hope that helps to clarify what are eligible costs and what are not.
Yes, thank you, Polly. Karen, would you share a little bit more? I know you mentioned this earlier, and you're principally speaking from your experience as the project subcommittee chair and all of the proposals that you've reviewed. specific to SIGHT this year, but I know you have extensive experience reviewing proposals in other IEEE programs as well. Specific to IEEE SIGHT, though, what is perhaps the most frequent feedback that reviewers give applicants in regards to their budget?
That the budget doesn't correlate well to what they actually said they were going to do, and that, or it's out of scope. So, for instance, you know, usually it's overestimating, and sometimes we see it the other way too. But sometimes they'll say, you know, we're going to need $30,000 to do a site assessment of, you know, or let's say we're going to develop an outreach workshop or something like that, and you're going to have 15 participants, and the cost per participant is $30,000. Then you're like, wow, that's crazy. What's going on here? We don't understand this. So that's a contrived example. I haven't actually seen that in any of our proposals, but usually things that are out of scope. The other big one that we see is that the collaboration is not really visible, or we don't have evidence that the collaboration is true, that, you know, well, have you had discussions before any proposal comes in? You really need to have had discussions with your partners, because you put together a proposal and say, oh yeah, well, we have the endorsement of the, you know, XYZ organization, and we don't have those support letters to do that. It's really, well, what evidence is there? And if there's some working with children, I think is a big one. If you're working with children and there are, you know, adults working with children, and you know, there's usually rules in place that they might background checks or safety checks to make sure that you know, you're okay to work with children. And if you're going into a school, that school might have special requirements itself and permissions, and those background checks sometimes cost money. So if you have to go in and get some sort of permits or insurance, I think that we oftentimes see that those things are omitted, and people come back and say, oh, I didn't, you know I needed insurance, or I didn't know that I, you know, needed to hire a school counselor to be present every time we were working with children. So if you have these discussions early with your partners, it's a discovery process, and you'll figure out what you need. And sometimes I even show them the budget and say, is this reasonable, you know, for working with your children? So if you're working on one of my favorite projects is a nutrition project that was done in India before SIGHT was officially formed, but they did really well figuring out how much does it cost you to feed, you know, 30 children a week or a month, and that they could budget it in, and then they had realistic numbers that correlated, that were generated from the partner, and not just guessing based on, you know, our outside knowledge if we're not members of that community.
Yes, that's a great point to focus on, and working together with partners in order to come up with costs or budget lines that are comprehensive and that are inclusive of things that could come up during the project. And this next question I'll open up to everyone again. What happens if things change in between submitting the SIGHT proposal that may have one number in the budget that was approved and that funding was awarded, and then if something happens before beginning the project or even in the middle of implementation that's going to affect your finances for the project? In an IEEE context, what would you recommend that groups do in that situation?
Sure. So this is Karen again. As the chair, when we give money and then we never hear from a group again, that becomes highly suspicious to us. It's like, oh my God, where'd they go? And if the groups that stay in contact with us and, you know, are open and transparent with us, we go above and beyond to support them. And, you know, I usually say this to students. I say, you know, if something's going wrong, you have a deadline on an assignment, you don't wait. You know, you got a year to do it. You don't wait, or you have a job. You don't wait the day before the assignment's due to say, oh, by the way, you know, we hit this snag and we didn't even get the project started. So I would say earlier the better, and even just keeping in touch with us, you know, sending us, oh, you know, we're on phase 1, we're in phase 2. You're not mandatory reporters in the sense that you have to tell us everything, but we love to hear updates. We love to get pictures, and I think that, keeping us engaged throughout your process. It not only allows us to help you, but it really empowers us so that if you need other resources or something changes, we're already up to speed with where you are. And it's not a, well, why is this coming up now type of deal.
Yeah, I can give a specific example of where things changed for us. So we have a SIGHT project in Cerrito de los Moreños, it's a small island community where we're doing some rehabilitation of some solar home systems and a workshop on how to maintain those systems. So one of the, did our preliminary visit to the community, explored what the issues were. We found that the main problem was the batteries were not functioning. And we thought that the charge controllers and inverters were fine. After we started to look at the systems more closely, we found that many of the charge controllers and inverters were not working. And so we had to adjust our budget and scope of work to reflect fewer homes that we would rehabilitate, requiring the replacement of parts that we hadn't anticipated at the beginning when we submitted the proposal. So then we went to the SIGHT committee and said we need to change the budget to reflect additional costs for the inverters and charge controllers. And so we were allowed to make a budget modification and a change of scope based on the that we had after we had started to work on the project.
That's a great example. Thank you, Polly, for sharing that. And I think, like Khanjan said, it just something to take into consideration at the beginning is that things will never go exactly according to plan. And so having a budget with some of the elements that have been discussed today can help mitigate some of those challenges in submitting or implementing a project and what happens if something changes right in the middle of that.
And
so I know we've, yes,
if I
please go ahead.
That what Karen said is important, that, you know, the SIGHT group wants to see these projects be a success. And so they're very supportive of making any adjustments that need to be made. And, you know, it's not unusual, as Khanjan mentioned, for projects to change as you're developing them in the field. So, you know, the SIGHT committee is very helpful and responsive in terms of adjusting parameters as you develop the project in the field.
Yes, definitely. And now here is a question that's very specific to IEEE, to HAC and SIGHT. Because all SIGHT groups are organized within IEEE OUs, what are steps that you, the panelists, would recommend group take with their section or with their OU, perhaps it's a student branch, when applying for SIGHT project funding, either before the application, during the application, and then after funding is awarded?
It is very important to coordinate with the section because the funds are typically transferred to a section or, you know, local organizational unit. It could be a student branch and so on. But it's very important to coordinate so that the section knows that this project is being submitted for funding, and then if funding comes, that they will be responsible for managing the flow of funds and supporting the financial aspects, as well as that they want to be aware of the projects that are going on in their sections and be able to support and contribute to those projects.
Right, and I'd like to add to that you might have to do a little bit of training for them, because if somebody comes in and says, you know, oh, you know, they see this money come into their budget, they might not understand how they might think they can spend it. Well, it came into my section, therefore I must be able to spend it. So you want to, before the money comes in, say we've gotten this, you know, or before, you know, you'll explain to them, here's the budget, there'll be specific line items, you know, that we'll be putting this towards, and the reporting process to them, because they're going to validate some of the receipts and things like that. But you don't want it to somebody to get this money and say, oh, this money came from SIGHT for humanitarian projects, and all of a sudden somebody jumps in and says, well, I'm doing a humanitarian project, I want access to that money. So the section has to understand, and the members in that section have to understand that this is designated money that was one awarded to a SIGHT group for a specific activity, for specific budget items, and not just funds available, you know, for the section to use at its own discretion.
That's a great point, and that's a really good recommendation, Karen. And one thing that I would just add from past experience with transferring funds is that we also strongly recommend that you check with your section chair or treasurer about any fees or charges on funds transferred, because you'll definitely want to include that in your budget ahead of time. These are usually fees that the section itself is charged depending on how IEEE is registered in that country. So this, I don't believe, is necessarily applicable in the United States, but again, just something that we would strongly recommend, and it goes along with that recommendation to start coordination as early as possible with the section as soon as you're thinking about applying for funding. Okay, so something else that Polly asked me to talk about a little bit is how funds are transferred within IEEE. And I can just give a very brief, don't want to provide overwhelming details, but definitely want to cover some of the steps between after a SIGHT group receives the news that their project is going to be funding, and how are those funds actually transferred to the IEEE OU, who is acting as the fiscal intermediary for those funds. So essentially, all funds originate in IEEE's New Jersey offices in the HAC and SIGHT accounts here in New Jersey. And then once the section chair or treasurer acknowledges that funds for a project may be transferred to their account, the first step that the staff team does is to draft those award documents. For those of you who have been project leads, you'll be familiar with these. Essentially, they include the terms of the funding, the reporting requirements, and the schedule for when interim reports and final reports are due. We also include IEEE's IP policy, and a couple other details on what conducting a SIGHT project is all about. And so then the project lead will sign those award documents, and that will allow us as staff members to submit a transfer of funds. So those funds would then be moved to the section's custody account or local bank account. Not necessarily just in the U.S., this would apply for the majority of the sections, the IEEE OU sections. And then if needed, the section can then transfer those funds from the custody account to their local account. And another note here that it's important to mention is that there may be limits on how much a section can transfer or spend each month. They may have transfer or spending limits placed. I believe a lot of our sections based outside of the U.S. Have these limits. And so this is something else that you'll definitely want to check with your section leadership when you are notified that you've been awarded funding, because it could affect your timeline on how soon the section is going to be able to disperse those funds to you and your project team. And that's really the last step. Then once the funds are in the section's account, they can be dispersed to the project team lead. So we definitely recommend adding in either 2 weeks to 1 month to your project timeline in order to allow for these transfers. For sections that are in India, those are handled a little bit differently, in that IEEE makes one transfer per month to the IEEE India office, and then from there, they're dispersed to the appropriate section. So depending on when your project is notified of the funding award, you could have to wait until the beginning of or you would always have to wait until the beginning of the next month in order for those funds just to reach the India offices. So we would recommend that project teams build in some time to allow for funds to reach you and your team members. Okay, so this time I believe we can now transfer over to the question and answer section of the webinar. And I'm just go ahead and please for our attendees, you can go ahead and write your questions either in the chat box or in the question and answer section. I'll go ahead and review all of those for you. Okay, so we do have one question submitted so far, which says, can you talk about the generalized steps to plan and budget for a project? Our student branch is new to this, just SIGHT in general.
Okay, so this is Karen. So the first thing that I would recommend is you have a project idea, and even if you haven't reached out yet to a community, you have a project idea, and I would look at the broad categories, like just do a brainstorming session saying, okay, if we were just to go implement this right now, just to build it from this aspect of implementation, what do we need? So you can almost start thinking about equipment. So you say, okay, we need equipment, we need to do, so we'll need software, we need testing things like that. So almost like if you were just to do it right now, what kind of categories would you need? And then after you get that, then you can broaden it to say, okay, now I'm going to do it not in a nice closed laboratory, but now I'm doing it out in the field. You know, what's going to happen? You know, is there a rain? Do I need tents because it's going to be, you know, this? Do I need portable heaters because it's going to be cold? So start thinking about what environmental factors you're going to have to encounter. And then, you know, then the next piece is to think about what is the community, that's when you need to start thinking about, well, what do the partners need? And and reach out to people. And that's why you give them a draft and say, here's what our project looks like. And we're trying to scope out what it would take to do this in your school or in your village. And then you start talking about, you know, access. Does it cost you money to get access? Security. If you're going into places where you need security or a driver because you don't know the remote area and you don't want to fall off a cliff because the roads are hazardous, you know, things like that. So that's when the community comes in. So I would look at it in three phases. One, just if I was to build this device or, you know, the prototype system in the lab today, what would it cost? The next piece is, okay, in the environment, now put it out in an environment. What environmental factors or in the field aspects are added. And then the third piece is, okay, now let's go back to the community and figure out what kind of things the community has. So that way you've got evolutions of it, or I would say different design iterations of your budget, and you can refine it as you go along. That's the broadest way to start.
Thank you for that advice, Karen. And so our next, I really just have a comment. It's not a question from Rodolfo. He says that the panel was awesome, and he got a lot of good advice in order to continue the HAC project that he is working on and leading in northern Argentina. So while we're waiting to see if any more questions come in, perhaps just something that I would ask all of you is, what's one bit of advice or one of the most important things that you would like to communicate to site groups who are working on a budget for their sustainable development project?
I would think the biggest thing is to be able to justify everything you put in, and to understand that that the money is supposed to be so you can implement the project, not so people can make money on the project that are implementing it.
Yeah, I would say making sure, as has been mentioned a couple of times, that there's a longer-term sustainability plan. So how is the investment that SIGHT is making into a project going to lead to a good project that has good outputs, outcomes, and so on, as Khanjan mentioned. But furthermore, how is it going to be sustained in the longer term to make sure that there are funds set aside to replace any components that need to be replaced. So I think long-term sustainability and building that into the project and making sure that that's considered is, I think, an important.
Just build on that and kind of say probably the same thing in different words, but the strategy should drive the budget and not the other way around. It should not be to have the budget that drives the strategy that, okay, let's get the money and do something with it, as opposed to here's the higher sustainable equilibrium that we are trying to reach, here are the longer term outcomes, and how do we now get resources, including financial resources from various entities, including SIGHT, to get to that beautiful set of outcomes.
Great. So it looks like those are all the questions that have been submitted. And I believe that concludes our session for today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining and for sharing your very insightful notes and tips and advice on how to construct a budget. I know that this is going to be a very valuable session that we'll continue to refer back to when groups come to us with questions about their budgets. And thank you to all the participants who joined in for today's webinar as well.